everyone, and welcome. Not sure where you're tuning in from, but here in Hamilton, it is very, very, very cold. So maybe you are experiencing the same coldness, or maybe you're out in BC where apparently it is quite beautiful out there. So us in Southern Ontario are very jealous of our friends and colleagues in BC. So my name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the McMaster Continuing Education, I'd like to thank you for joining us for another talk in our Caregiver Essentials webinar series. Today, we are so pleased to have Marc Séguin here with us to discuss family meetings that work, strengthening communication for care and life transitions. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which this webinar is taking place is McMaster University, and we recognize that it is on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the host of our Caregiving Essentials webinar series, Donna Thomson. Donna is a caregiver, author, and educator. She's the author of two best-selling books on caregiving, including The Unexpected Journey of Caring. Donna also facilitates our free online course for caregivers, Caregiving Essentials. She is also the co-designer of the Creating Caregiver-Friendly Workplaces course and co-designer and co-instructor of the Family Engagement and Research course, all of which are here at McMaster in our continuing education department. And Marc Séguin is the author of Advocacy and Aging, a book about building your team of caregivers and advocates for life transitions. And also, I'm very pleased to say that Marc is a regular attendee of these Caregiving Essentials webinars. So Marc has helped many families, including his own, plan for and deal with the inevitable changes in life triggered by natural aging, life events, or illness. These experiences have led him to develop the PACT, Plan, Activate, Communicate, Transition planning framework, allowing all to live with peace of mind, knowing wishes, beliefs, and values are well communicated and trusted caregivers are prepared to transition and support personal affairs and care. Thanks, Marc, for joining us today. And Donna, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Christine. I'm delighted to be here today with Marc Séguin. And, Marc, I've seen you in the chat many times. You've come to participate, active participant in the chat, experienced caregiver. We have so much expertise in the caregiving community. And I love that. I love that you took your lived experience, Marc, in your family, your lived experience of caregiving, and you've written a book, you've done so many things, you give keynotes, you give workshops, and we'll do a deep dive into your work and your approach in a minute. But can you start, Marc, by telling us about your own family caregiving experience and maybe some of the lessons you learned that made you think, gosh, I think I'm onto something here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. As you said, I've been attending these webinars for a few years, and I think what you guys all collectively do is wonderful, and to be part of it is pretty gratifying, to humbly say. So let's dive into your question. So my first experience with caregiving was really through assisting my wife. My wife had to get involved with her parents. Her parents got diagnosed both with dementia, which apparently is very rare at the same time. And we live in Ottawa, and her parents were in Burlington, and she first spent, the good part of 12 months commuting and spending a week in the early stages. And eventually she had to work through the every phase of transition, as we probably know about dementia, and, over a period of 10 years. And there was all kinds of permutation, but really, that was my first eye-opening experience. My second experience that probably was more firsthand is I got involved early with my parents. They were quite healthy in the mid 80s, and then we assisted them first through a transition from their permanent home that was in Laurentian to move back to the city. And then there was gradual decline. My mom had dementia. Unfortunately, her dementia was she manifests itself pretty aggressively and with a lot of defiance. So it's very hard on my dad and the rest of the family. And then we'll talk a little bit later. There was all the stages of moving to retirement home, assisted living, and so on. And then my dad has his own degradation. My mom passed away 3 years ago, and my dad last month at 98 and a half. So we'll talk more into details, but that's my experience. Really was kind of an inspiration to, okay, this is a new reality. We're all going to live longer. And unlike the previous generation, we need to talk about death because we need to talk about life when life degrades. And no one wants to hear that, but that's the new reality. Because we live longer, the medical sciences provided us many new opportunities. But because you have degradation, uh, the new reality is that we're going to seek help. We're going to need help. And let's not wait until a crisis to get that help. Let's prepare ourselves for that by openly talking about it and preparing for that. So that's kind of a bit of a trigger to how I started getting involved in this whole space.
Hmm. You know, it's so interesting because that you just sort of put in a nutshell and described for us um, some of the reasons, the fundamental reasons that we decided to put our energy behind this program of Caregiving Essentials. I mean, people shouldn't have to learn from their mistakes as they're moving from crisis to crisis. It just should be easier if we know a bit about what to expect, how to do project management of caring at the end of somebody's life. And so you have really cracked this nut, Mark. I mean, can you tell us about your book and your approach, which we call PACT, P-A-C-T?
Yeah, so thank you very much for introducing that. First of all, I'll say I never planned to write a book. If my school grade teacher knew that I wrote a book, she'd be quite impressed, but actually quite surprised, to be very candid. Um, it's interesting. You use the word learn by your mistake. Through my in-laws, I observed that even though my father-in-law was very keen and planned for a lot of things, he had not planned for using his losing or seeing degraded cognitive abilities. So that was a learning. And by getting involved early with my parents, I felt that I was becoming more proactive. Ultimately, I started thinking my own plan. How do I plan for losing cognitive ability? How do I plan for the unplanned? You know, people think, how do you plan for unplanned? Doesn't make sense. But that's what was going through my mind. And as I started working things, not only I've kind of developed the framework, but people got interested around me, and people eventually sought my advice on a number of things. And I eventually I evolved the what I call the PACT framework. And maybe Jenna, you could show a little bit what the PACT framework is about. But fundamentally, as was stated earlier, PACT stands for plan, activate, communicate, and transition. I'm not going to go through a lot of details at this point in time, but I'm going to say that most people know that planning is important. A lot of people procrastinate. Few people have a complete plan. And historically, in the old school, planning was more on the financial side and plan for a will and so on. Because of the new reality that, you know, we got living years with degraded capability, you need to incorporate, you know, the healthcare, the degradation, and all that plan, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of the first dimension. Then, you know, having a plan is not sufficient. A plan is only as good as it's well understood. And it has to be understood by the people that will support you. And literally, you want to build a team of advocates. So it's more than planning. So you need to put it, activate it, make it alive and accessible. You know, basically, people should be empowered to act on your behalf without having to go through long, complicated process. Ultimately, I think the most important is communication. If you could build a team of people around you that could advocate for you, that could understand your wishes and values and beliefs, that's the key. And ultimately, I'm a very big proponent of start early transition. And early transition may be as easy as share with other people or have people shadowing you and so on and so forth. So that's kind of a, you know, it sounds like an obvious approach, but when you think about it, we all have difficulty um, planning, but we need to go beyond planning. We need to broaden the scope of the planning to include the power of attorneys, the healthcare, possibly an advanced care plan, and so on and so forth. And then build a team around you that will be there, that actually want to be there to support you in those circumstances where it's important. So by being proactive, you'll be able to not only be prepared, but prevent a number of the more difficult situation we hear when people try to catch up in caregiving during a crisis.
Hmm. So if we think about the family meeting, um, when you and I started chatting and I read your book and I thought, oh, there's so much practical wisdom here. Um, but you and I landed on this theme of the family meeting as a critical element of success in the PACT approach. Um, and family meetings, as we know, they can really go sideways if people are not all on the same page. And who is the person who suffers most if that's the case? It's going to be um, the patient or the person receiving care, of course. So we really want to try to figure out what are the elements or ingredients of making the family meetings a success, getting everybody on the same page and moving together as a team with one voice, really, in support of the person receiving care. So thinking about um, transitions and what you've just said about planning, in terms of the family coming together, what can you say, Marc, about when should people begin to plan in a family? And in terms of planning for what you don't know, um, let's think about how people move through a disease progression. So from the pre-planning, I'm older, but I'm healthy, but I might as well start planning now because I'm not going to get younger. So maybe a person could begin to do this for themselves, or maybe the planning begins the day after getting a diagnosis. So when do you think is the optimal time to start planning and thinking about that first family meeting? Like how how and when? What are the elements of success for that stage?
There's a number of questions, so I'm gonna come on a number of dimensions there, but you brought up a lot of very good important points here. So the first, I'll make the answer very simple. When you start, it's now. And I'm pretty very clear that the planning starts now, and whether you're healthy or not, whether you're young or elderly in different circumstance. Let me talk about, and I'm going to refer a lot to various examples, and I do have some examples of friends and families and other people. But I'm going to kind of relate to the ones that I have. So I'm going to speak about maybe quickly two stories. So there's the one with my parents, and my parents were in their mid 80s when I got involved. And then I'll talk a little bit more after about what I'm doing with family, and then there'll be subsequent questions. So I don't want to spend all the too much time on either one of these. But with my parents, it's an interesting case, but it's never too late to get started because my parents had a wonderful retirement. They were in their mid 80s, high quality of life, very active, lots of friends, a lot of social engagement, so on. But they were getting at a stage where, bopping around was going to get more difficult. And we had not really had conversation. My parents were the old generation. They basically had told my sister and I that we were co-executor. We do have a will, and the will's in a fireproof box in the cupboard, and that's as much as the conversations that we had. I had not really worried about it because they were having a good active life. Everything seemed to be fine. And I knew the house was paid for. So in the worst case, there was a bit of a buffer. Not a huge buffer because of a pretty humble house, but enough there to give me confidence. And then there was a trigger. And I use the word trigger because a lot of time it's hard for people to get started in these conversations. But if you look for a trigger to start a conversation, it could help. In this case, It just happened. In a Friday night in mid-February 2014, I got a call and my parents said, we sold the house. And, and it was good news because they've been living in the countryside in Laurentians, moving to Montreal. And it was about time that they stopped driving back and forth to Montreal, sometimes coming late at night after a concert at Place des Arts. Uh, for my dad at 88, it was too much stress to drive that late. And my mother didn't think so, but we thought so. Anyway, so it was all welcome news. And this was a Friday night. On the Saturday morning, I woke up and I kind of said, what's their plan? What are they going to do? So all these questions and concerns start emerging in my mind. And my parents had a humble lifestyle, so I didn't even know if they had the affordability to move to the city, if maybe in a retirement home and so on. I didn't know much. So that was a bit of a trigger to me to ask them, can we meet? And in your definition of a meeting, I guess that was the first meeting where we met my parents. I met my parents. And fundamentally, I said, what's the plan? Where are you planning to move? What's your vision? And so on. And honestly, I got blank stares. And that was kind of an interesting moment for me that I still remember. And, at that point in time, I said, I would welcome the opportunity to work with you, put together a vision, maybe revise your plan and update your plan and see how we can make sure that it works out. My dad was very welcoming. Both my parents knew I had some affinity in this domain, and my mom was a little bit reticent at first. She was a proud person, proud of her independence, not needing to seek help from the kids. And that's something that we had to work. But ultimately, I told her, I said, listen, I myself need to know whether I need to plan to support you and how to support you. And what about my siblings? And, we don't know. You guys are so healthy, you may live to 110. And what if, and I talk about experience, what if both of you has to be in assisted living and the cost of that, which I had just experienced with my parents. So all this to say is that was the start of the meeting and the open conversation, but it was triggered. What happened after that was very important, is we spent 6 months to put a plan together. And a lot of people would say, 6 months? What did you do over 6 months? Well, the financial planner probably could have done the plan within a week. You already had a plan. I could have, gathered information and put together a plan in a few weeks. But that's what it was not all about. It was about relationship building, a new kind of relationship with my parents, about trust building. And and there was a few moments where, we need to challenge because, my mom loved the financial advisor and we had to work things in slightly different way with different angles. All this to say is through that time, we had some more formal family meeting with the advisor, but a lot of informal conversation. But to me, that was the start. And we talk about family meeting, about family conversation, because after that, we got my sister engaged. We start working the power of attorneys. And then we started working the healthcare side. And my sister which was more on the caregiving side, got involved. And that 6 to 9 months was the start of a new mode of operation that became incredible. And I think I said this to you, Donna, before. To this day, I not only cherish the new kind of relationship I built with my parents through that period, but that I learned the way they do things and what their thought process is. And for the 10 and 12 subsequent years, and still to this day, even when I act on the execution of the will, I do it in the way my parents would have done it, not the way I like to do things necessarily. And it really got ingrained in me, but it's not a process of just meet once. It's an ongoing, continuous process. Okay.
Mhm.
So that to me, a bit of summary of, these meetings are important. They're hard to get started, but once you get started, you get into a mode that allows you to go deeper and broader. Quickly, I'll just mention with my own family, which is totally different situation. There's hopefully not an imminent event or not an existing event where we need some assistance. But in preparation, we basically got on a path of having a yearly family meeting. We're on year 5. I've given myself 10 years to get to the depth and breadth of where I want to go to, and we could talk a little later of what we have done and how we're going about these meetings. But in the end, to answer your questions, these being proactive is an opportunity to set yourself up not only to be prepared, but to really have deeper relationship that will be so important at critical moments.
Hmm. Well, it's so interesting. And what strikes me about what you've just described in your own family is this question of um, the subject of the conversation being what if? And did you have problems, or in all of the work that you do with different families, it must come up that some people, even if they're faced with a very serious diagnosis themselves, do not want to discuss what if. Certainly, my mother did not. She did not want to accept her own frailty, her own aging process, progressive loss, the onset of dementia. She didn't want to accept any of it. And so she did not want to discuss um, anything with my sister and me in the way of planning. How do people get around that resistance to have a family meeting? Or do you just go about having a family meeting without your parents if they refuse to discuss?
Well, I think yes, what you're describing is everyone's reality, right?
Mhm.
Um, as I may have mentioned it to you before, I actually did give some workshops on with an organization called Compassionate Ottawa on advanced care planning. And it's interesting in that organization and everywhere I go, everyone says you need to communicate and so on and so forth. And when you get to these workshops and work with people, we want to start the conversation, and it's hard. It's hard to get so you need to find some mechanism to open up the conversations. And yes, there's some barriers. Everyone will have barriers, and you need to acknowledge, there's a lot of facilitating skills in corporate workplace and caregiving and in medical science. So you need to get down to basic principles. So you need to acknowledge there's a barrier, and you need to take your time. There's no rush. Like I said, with my parents, it was a process of 6 months, and I can't recall exactly all the barriers, but along the path there was a number of barriers. We had to breathe deep and not ignore it and say, how are we going to get across this?
Mhm.
And really, I'm going to, almost insist that it's not about deflecting or going around the problem. Is basically say we need to discuss about this and find a a slow, constructive, caring approach to be able to say, I need to discuss this. And sometimes it's harder, and sometimes you need to acknowledge baby steps and build on those. And sometimes you may not be able to pass baby steps. But that's the reality. And you mentioned it. When comes time to kind of preempt, especially if you're doing a proactive healthcare directive or advanced care plan, to say, what if this happens? What if that happens? And so on. It's not easy. It's really it's not easy for people to put themselves in that position, especially if they want to resist that, right? So.
Mhm. So, this idea of the family meeting has so many directions we could take this conversation. But I guess the first thing I want to talk about is what happens if, for example, you and your siblings, there are usually, I mean, typically, some people are solo caregivers for a family member and there are no siblings, but oftentimes there are. And thinking in the context of transitions or medical decision making, what if the siblings disagree? What then? What are some strategies that you could advise in families where there is fundamental disagreement? I know that you've already outlined one, which is that you were humble in your listening to your parents. And you were very open to understanding what it was that they wanted. Um, but what happens if other people in the family who are in that family meeting and have a say and will be impacted themselves by the decisions being made in family meetings. What happens if people disagree? What do you do?
Well, it's very important that you raise this point. And the first thing I'm going to say is let's differentiate between the word agree, disagree, and the word respect.
Ah,
Okay. And, a lot of people think it's about, agreeing or disagreeing. No, it's about respecting the values, the beliefs, and the wishes of, the party in question. So, if you pointed out a very important point. If you wait for a life event, a crisis, or a difficult decision, typically the true personality of people emerges in those circumstances. I've learned that in my business world. I've learned that in, personal life and so on and so forth. The true personality of people emerges in there. And that's okay. We need to recognize that. But families in general need to recognize that even though there's a family unit, even though we grew up with the parents giving us presumably the same values and beliefs, fundamentally as teenagers, as in young adults, and as your adulthood continues, one's values and beliefs evolves.
mhm.
Okay. And so to me, it's a recognition of those values and beliefs are different, respecting them, acknowledging them, and then, you know, if you could be proactive, to me, the purpose of an ongoing conversation and family meetings going deeper and deeper is eventually these are going to surface. You're not going to wait for a life event or crisis to recognize, well, Paul or Mary think differently about this. Well, that's fine. But what does mom and dad really want? And if we could proactively do that. Now, if you wait until a crisis, then you need to kind of backpedal into that reality and kind of find a way to acknowledge that, hey, our disagreement here may be among ourselves. Let's try to think of mom and dad, what their wishes, and whether let's agree to disagree, but our job here is to respect what mom and dad wants. So it's kind of that process of stepping back, and it's not like my idea is better than yours or my value is better than yours. It's about thinking ultimately who's the stakeholder here, who's the person we're caring about, what are their values and wishes, and if they're explicit, then it's a matter of respecting them, whether we agree or not. And so to me, those dimensions are very, very important to bring in place, and that's how you kind of deflect a crisis where it's A versus B. It's not A versus B. It's let's go back to the central point of one's wishes and they're based on solid values and belief, whether you agree or not.
Yeah, which brings up a point that Tobin has written in the chat, and which is, you know, if you have had early conversations with your parents about their values and beliefs and wishes, then it's so much easier to move forward as a team, particularly if there is cognitive decline and cognitive impairment as part of their aging or disease process. And um, so we have a question here that how do you manage that if the person is already in the midst of cognitive impairment when you begin your family meeting processes for decision making? How do you manage that then? What are the conversations that occur in the family meeting?
Well, I probably the best reference I have on this one, the personal experience I could share is probably with my own family, where my mom had probably when I got involved in 2014, probably early signs of dementia. I've got tuned into to dementia signs and symptoms through my in-laws, but uh, it took probably a few years between my siblings and I, and even my dad, to recognize that these difficult behaviors that we were facing were not only due to some of my mom's childhood baggage, if you want, or some of her depression triggers, because everyone kind of had their views of that. But uh, ultimately, we had a lot of conversations among the siblings and eventually siblings and my dad to kind of say, well, this is what's happening and try to put piece together. And it took a while to piece it together. But again, it was the approach of open conversations, some of them informal, some of them more formal when we all got together. Uh, and, ultimately with time, we kind of said, yeah, this is not mom's natural behavior. This is an illness. And at one point, there's always that difficult choice of how you consult the person and respect what the person is saying versus maybe it's the illness speaking, not the person. And those are difficult transition. But once you get to a point where you could work together to recognize the stage where you're at and differentiate between listening because there's still some value coming out of the person versus trying to make a judgment call that, certain things we need to push forward and agree on. So it's not easy, but I'm going to tell you, if you could openly acknowledge and talk about it, that helps. And clearly, the earlier, the better. But you don't know. I'm going to say in the case both my in-laws and my parents, uh, we certainly didn't have the opportunity of an advanced care plan the way I would have wished be done, right? So you have to do your best, but again, I'll kind of differentiate between what the right real person say versus what the person's saying versus let's agree the stage. And it took a while before, I'm going to say, between the time I felt my mom had dementia or early stages of dementia, the time the siblings, probably 5 years.
Okay.
And by the time my dad formally acknowledged that it was not his wife, because my mom was aggressive and defiant, by the way. And so that was very difficult. It's probably from time zero to time five to time seven to time eight when she was formally diagnosed. So, it's a bit of a message to people. If you're not proactive, there could be many, many years of difficult situations to manage.
Mhm.
And you need to be there as caregiver and supporter through those years.
Yeah.
Uh,
But it also makes me think, putting myself in your place, Mark, over those years, um, that maybe that it might be easier if people are not wanting to talk about a big, awful diagnostic word, dementia, they don't just want to accept it, then maybe it's like, what are we going to do? Mom got really mad. How can we keep her more calm? She seems to get more angry between 6 and 8, like in the evening. Maybe what can we do in that time period of her daily routine to, like, issue by issue by issue might be helpful for some families, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from the caregiving world, you guys know, I mean, there's so much resources on whether it's dementia, ALS, or cancer. So, absolutely, and some of them are more difficult because if you don't have a diagnosis, but, I absolutely think that, you refocus the energy around resources. And, if someone, I could find a few example where one person was interested in some research and reading, then shared it among the others and brought everyone on board to, yeah, uh, let's see if we could do that. Yeah. So absolutely. And, from that perspective, there's a lot of resources. And, there's all kinds of also more in-depth approach of how to deal with an illness as a family. I mean, I think it was in November you invited Dr. Sao and Wanamaker, and they have their framework. So, uh, yeah, absolutely. Use those reference and resources. And it's to me, it's always about um, feeling comfortable to go into topics that were historically not easy or never approached as a family, especially as as adult, the children, we all grow up somewhat apart with different ways of thinking. So if you kind of find a mechanism to build a relationship where we could deal with more difficult situation early on, then yeah, you could use those resources more proactively as opposed to be in catch-up mode, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, s- so many people are contributing to the chat. There's just so many people concerned and wondering and asking themselves questions about this issue of how to have successful family meetings so that you are giving effective support to the person that everybody cares about in the family. So I want to go back to a comment that Bonnie made. Um, and she says here, sometimes time is not your friend. My dad wouldn't ask for help. He finally did, but I was operating behind the power curve. But what I did dad and mom's plan at the same time. I was working against mom having dementia. Dad later had dementia. Glad I did it all at the same time. And that makes me wonder, Mark, do you do you talk about with, in the context of your work in advocacy on aging, do you think about the family meeting as um, a meeting where everybody gets a say and what are your values, what are your limitations maybe in a role that you want to play? Um, what, uh, who are you in our family and who do you want to be on the team for advocacy moving forward? Like, does everybody get to have a say in the family meeting?
Well, if you, so the best, yes, I'm going to say yes. And the best way I can answer that question, if you really want my opinion,
Yes.
I'm going to
Good.
tell you what I've done for my family. Okay. Because, um, I'm at I'm in the aging stage, but I'm still young. I'm still healthy, quite active. And some people say, well, you don't have to worry about that. And I have a lot of people say, why are you doing this? But let me tell you what I've done with my family meetings, just to say. So I'm on year 5. Okay. So in the first year, kept it very simple. I told them, we got them engaged in what to finalize the decision of who would be our executors and the delegates in their power of attorney. Even though we had done our homework, my wife and I, we kind of got them engaged. Who was in the family meeting? All my children, including my daughter-in-law. Some people ask, do you include the in-laws or not? Absolutely. In our case, it was, let's keep it simple. Let's be inclusive. Let's be open. We'll bring the subject we want to discuss openly if they want to discuss subject. But we kept the first one very simple. Told them we have a will, power of attorney. We're allowed to finalize the delegates there and why. And we actually shared our healthcare directives, which ours was pretty detailed, but we didn't discuss it. So that was year 1. Year 2, we actually we played a game with Post-its, so we decided to make it more fun and so on. And I had seen some statement in one of the advanced care planning workshop that kind of provoke your thought process. And even though we had the healthcare directive, we decided to use the 18 statements and use Post-it to see people's views, their views for themselves, their views of what they understood ours and played around and had people organize them among themselves and so on. So very engaging, and so on and so forth. So that was year 2. Year 3 was more focused on the financials, where we openly uh, told them a bit more of our situation and so on. So give them peace of mind, as well as should there be care, how there's a reserve pot in exceptional circumstance, and explain that. The year 4 was interesting, and I did want to eventually talk about this because we decided it was all good talk, but I really wanted to see if they were really ready for life transitions. So we decided we wanted to get their hands a little bit dirty into this process. And so we ran a scenario, and the scenario goes as follows. Mom and dad were in a car accident. Dad passed away, and he's been asked you are being asked what to do with the body and what his wishes would have been.
Mm.
Mom turned out caused the accident. She had a heart episode during the accident. She is now unconscious, intubated in the hospital. You're being asked whether they could do a blood transfusion and whether they could do an operation to implant a device. And by the way, it's the end of the month, and the mortgage is due on the rental property, and the payments are and the incomes are due. What do you do? So this was an interesting scenario because it brought the theory into practice, where we wanted them to recognize each other's role a little bit, but everyone's involved. It's a team. We wanted them to recognize there was an organizer with all of our affairs well documented to be prepared. We had a healthcare directive and so on and so forth. I won't go through the details, but maybe people are curious. I was very pleased with the outcome because it was interesting. It's actually my daughter-in-law that first says, "Well, didn't your parents have a healthcare directive? We should go and take a look at that." And then all of a sudden it started the conversation. And I was very pleased because they started working as a team, even though up to now they've just been kind of passive and listening. So, anyways, I'm just telling you a little bit of what I've done to proactively say, now, one part of the question is, up to now, I'm going to say the focus has been on us, meaning what if something happens to us and so on and so forth. We eventually, I want to get to a point where they think of putting their own healthcare direct advanced care plan in place, starting to think. And we did a bit of that this year because we had a bit of it this year. We shifted it with a chat on plan giving and your value in life. And through that conversation, a bit unexpected, to be honest with you, they said, "Well, this is where we're in a stage in life, and here's what our needs are," and so on. So all of a sudden, the dialogue shifted to them. So I'm not sure that answers what the question is, but I'm giving a little bit of, my view is yes, you need to put a plan in place. Yes, you could start conversation. I'm on a goal to get deeper and broader over time, and we're using different technique. And we're not, we spend an hour and a half per year, so it's not burden. But now the family has gotten used to this, and to some extent, I'm not sure they're anxious for it, but I think they welcome it because it's been unintrusive and really, I think they appreciate the openness. So I'm not sure that totally answered the question, but I wanted to give you a bit of a feel of another approach than what I did with my parents. That's more very proactive. And it basically say it starts now, open conversation, and yes, eventually you want it to be two ways and as much as possible. But you got to first open up yourself and
Mm.
a bit of that vulnerability first.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting. Some of the questions in the chat are very practical, and one of the questions is, um, how does a family meeting differ from a care planning meeting? And so, if I may, because I don't want to elaborate on this too much, but when you and I talked about what today was going to be about, we were thinking of the family meeting writ large. So sometimes a family meeting will be a care plan meeting, and sometimes it's going to be about what are we going to do about summer holidays this year, which isn't that's a family meeting. So we're talking about big picture. I just wanted to clarify that for the listeners today. Um, I also wanted to ask you, someone wrote in the chat, is there a template for how these conversations should go? What are the words that I use? I think some people will be really looking for um, a conversation guide. Now, can you talk a little bit about how that is explained and offered in your book?
Uh, first of all, I'm gonna say no, I don't have a template per se. Okay. Now, I know that prior to me writing my book, there's a book that influenced me called Willing Wisdom. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but basically that particular book suggests 7 questions you discuss in family meetings. And if you go back and listen to these or pay attention to 7 questions, there are just questions that force deeper discussion, not just a quick answer. And they sound simple, but they're not something you typically do. Because of my experience seeing how different approach was used in my in-laws family, uh, my immediate family, I speak to a lot of people on what they do. I don't think there's a one method fits for all. I think it's agreeing there's um, this is important and finding a first trigger and a first approach. One of my friend was triggered by the Willing Wisdom book, and she uses 7 questions and started meeting. And she's much more formalized. She has an agenda. She writes notes and so on, and lets people. That's not something I've done. She has a meeting with her sibling that was with her immediate family. She has a meeting with her sibling, which lost their parents early in life, and they all got together every year. And all of a sudden, I think on one of these weekend meetings, someone triggered something. What about cremation? Would you believe in that or whatever? And it started conversation, and they still have their yearly meetings as a family. It's a get together, but they reserve an hour and a half every year, formally now to talk about planning for end of life and planning for advanced care and so on and so forth. So it happens differently. And I say, in general, start by recognizing it's important, how you think it would be important and how it would fit your environment. Find a trigger to get started. And then perhaps, you may want to go in a more formal way. And there's different resources available. In my book, I don't go into very much deep, but I suggest there's concept of sub teams. It's not only your core team of delegates. There's how do you work with your advisors? How do you work with the healthcare providers around you? How do you work with a greater family or your friends and perhaps the trades that may be there one day to help you in home care? So I do bring that concept of the various people you need to build some form of relationship and communications with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because um we I think you're being very humble because what I found in your book was through the storytelling, the anecdotes. Um there is so much richness in those anecdotes, and as I was reading through them, I thought, oh, that one's like my family. That one's not like my family. And so I was able to imagine how personally, my family meetings with my sister and our husbands around my mother's care, we could have been better if we had been a little bit more thoughtful beforehand, a little bit more able to plan and be strategic within our family meetings. Um, I think, yeah, we just sort of muddled through, and uh, we reacted to whatever was happening.
Let me jump on it because you triggered a few things. Then, because I'm thinking of these webinars more of the caregiving. There are a few things I'm gonna say since you mentioned a few things about the book. So the book is storytelling, so there's enough there to trigger enough topics. So I've devised the book in 5 pillars, and there is a checklist at the end of each pillar. And the idea there is very much that every year you should go through your checklist and see what is it you've done, what is it you haven't done, what is this you want to talk about, and so on and so forth. So there, if you want to think of a template, there's a bit of a template there. And then at 2 places, even though I don't prescribe a format for an advanced care plan or a healthcare directive, there's a bit of a table of content of what you would put in your advanced care plan in the book at I can't remember the page, but it's around page 40. And there's also a template for what I call an organizer, so a place to where you document your affairs. So yes, so sorry, because my focus family meeting is maybe not formally about family meetings, the templates, but there's a structure in place there to have basically your full scope of plan and elements of this.
Thank you. And, I think we don't have too much time left, but we've got some very important questions that we're going to try to squeeze into the end of our chat today. The next one I want to ask you, Mark, comes from one of our listeners who writes, I am 80 years old with spinal stenosis. My adult daughter and son both have lifelong special needs. My only sister is elderly with health issues. My friends are elderly as well. What are my options? And I think when we think, I'm going to ask you, what can a family meeting be when there effectively is no family? How does one bring a team together? What could that look like? Can you speak a little bit about how can we identify either care professionals, neighbors, other people in your life that you might give a proxy role of family to them in order to say, would you like to have a role in my family? You're not my blood family, but would you be my family for the purpose of planning and family meetings? Do you ever see that?
Oh, because I mean, um, I'm going to say probably the biggest eye-opening that I've had every speaking engagement is when I hear about this, people that have this situation. So I'm going to apologize because we always focus on families and in a traditional way, but really the word family should be in a broader sense of the term. Okay. And yes, not, yes, sometimes people need to look more broadly around who's your surrounding. And it could be from, like I said, I talk about different sub teams, but you could look at who's the team at advisor around you, and they may have even services around them. Friends, family, distant relatives, and so on and so forth. They want to be there to support you. They may not know that you have that concern and so on and so forth. Healthcare world has a whole bunch of avenues. And then I'm going to say, well, look at where your life has been involved. You are part of an association, you're part of a neighborhood, and so on and so forth. Uh, so it's more difficult sometimes to step back because, and even when you select, and I'm going to say even people that have a traditional family, when you select your executor or whatever, it may not be your family that's the best person your interests in mind or that has the time or the capabilities and so on and so forth. So this question is not only for people that may not have immediate family, but for everybody. So I just say I think you need to step back and reflect. I've worked with a few people. It's a little harder on the healthcare side than on the financial side. I must admit, because there's trust services and people that could handle your financials. But you need to step back and think a little more deeply, and you'll be surprised at how many people want to be there to help you in the times of need. I'm going to give you quickly the ultimate example. Um, there's a lady through Compassion Ottawa that is a doctor, and she had a neighbor in their apartment retirement building who basically was alone with her husband. Her husband passed away, and she got diagnosed with cancer and literally went through the process. And she decided she wanted to have maid. And she was looking for someone to accompany her. She literally knocked to the neighbor's door and this person accompanied her, and it turned out she couldn't have hit a better person because this person was a retired doctor, but also had been involved in a compassionate organization. But here's an example of someone that had nobody. uh, this person reached out to a neighbor and they built a strong relationship through that whole process. Uh, and there was a link to a long lost cousin in Romania that they got a hold of. But that's perhaps a more extreme example, but you need to step out of your box and
Yeah.
and proactively look.
That's a beautiful story to end on. And I want to thank you so much, Mark. I want to thank everybody who was here with us today listening because the chat is so full of advice and reflection, experience, and different perspectives on this issue of how to have family meetings and what is the role of the family meeting in making our caring lives as families a little bit easier as we move forward through the aging process and through all of the project management that has to occur in terms of financial planning and care planning, both, and life planning. Um,
It is about
so
life planning.
it's
Absolutely.
life planning, yeah, in all of its myriad of messiness, as you said, but it can be done, and we've seen and heard that today, and we thank you, Mark, for sharing with us what you've learned along the way and sharing. I encourage everyone to read your book. It's full of wisdom and practical ideas of how to move through this smoothly. So thank you very much. And over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Donna and Mark. Yeah, listening to it, it was a wonderful talk, and certainly I learned there's never too late to start, but the earlier you start, probably the better. And that consensus doesn't always have to mean agreeing with everything. It just sort of means being respectful of the views that your siblings or your extended family have. Or maybe they aren't family. Maybe they're your right. I think we have like family, chosen family. Isn't that the word, right? Where you have your sort of biological family and then you have your chosen family. And so whatever you have, as long as you're surrounded by people who love you and support you, it doesn't really matter if they're related or not. So I should let everyone know that we are taking March off, but we will be back in April. We're still confirming our speaker, so we don't want to give you too much information. Our speaker is a very busy individual in the caregiving world. So we're working on that. So I guess I'll just say thank you everyone for joining us. You'll receive a link later this week. And if you are in frigid parts of Canada, like Donna and Mark are in Ottawa, I'm here in Hamilton. Well, please stay warm. And maybe in April we'll actually have some heat, some
Can,
warmth.
can I add a last point?
Of course.
So I'm not sure, Jen, if you have a chance to put the slide up, but I love this subject, and if there's a lot of comments on subject, I love when people reach out to me via email or reach out to me on my phone number. It's available on my website if we could get posted here, but absolutely feel free to reach out by email, by phone, other mechanism. I really would love to continue the conversation in one way or another. So thank you very much for your proactive participation today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark and Donna, and thank you everyone. Have a great afternoon. Take care.